Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to be doing a non-spoilery review for Long Live the Pumpkin Queen by Shea Ernshaw. Every time I read a Disney book, I usually will do a dedicated review video for it, and this one was certainly no exception. I think this is probably my most anticipated release for this year because, as you guys can probably tell, I am a huge Nightmare Before Christmas Tim Burton fan, so I was very excited for this book. But before we get into my thoughts on this book, let me tell you a bit about what it is about. So this book takes place after the events of The Nightmare Before Christmas. At the beginning of this book, Jack and Sally get married and they honeymoon in Valentine's Day Town, and then when they come back to Halloween Town, Sally and Zero are wandering through the forest when they come across another doorway in a tree, and upon accidentally leaving this door open, they unleash a new nightmare on Halloween Town, and Sally by herself has to try and set things right again. As I said, I was very excited for this book, but I was equally very nervous, as I usually am when it comes to any Disney books, because these are just beloved characters that I love and feel like I know so well, so having them in the hands of somebody else can also be very stressful because you really want them to do the characters the way that you think of them in your head, which obviously everybody kind of has them in their head a little bit differently, but I'm always nervous going into a Disney book. But I'm happy to say that for the most part, I was really pleased with this book. I can easily see this being like a comfort read for myself and a lot of other people who love The Nightmare Before Christmas, and if Disney ever decided to adapt this and make a sequel, I can see this being one of my favorite films as well, because there's so much of the Nightmare Before Christmas world that we explore in this book. So right off the bat, I did really enjoy it and I would recommend it, but now let's get into more specific things. In that, number one, I was a little bit underwhelmed with certain parts of this book. Now, that didn't completely take away from the story as a whole. I still think it was very good. I would still recommend it, but there were two things that I was kind of underwhelmed by, and I don't even know if you would say that either of these things are really the book's fault as much as it's just a personal preference. So one of them is definitely not the book's fault, and that's just the fact that this story is very simplistic because it is made for a younger audience than myself. Now, the thing is, I obviously love The Nightmare Before Christmas, which is also kind of a simplistic story. I love watching Disney movies, so I am used to consuming those kinds of very simple stories in like movie form or visual form. I'm used to that, whereas with books, I never read middle grades. I barely read YA anymore. I tend to just read a lot of heavier, more complex books, so I'm not really used to reading such a simple story. So for that reason, I was a little bit underwhelmed by this, but like I said, that is not the book's fault at all. That's just my own personal preference. The other thing, though, is that I think I was a little bit underwhelmed with the Nightmare Before Christmas or Tim Burton vibe of this book. And I think the reason for that is because I think most of us that love Tim Burton or The Nightmare Before Christmas can agree that like one of the best things about it is the visuals. I feel like had this book had illustrations, it would have added to the atmosphere of the book so much, because you just don't get the same kind of like vibe from reading the book as you do when you're watching the movie with the stop motion animation and all of the colors and just like that Tim Burton artwork. You just don't get it when you're reading this book. So the entire time that I was reading it, I just felt like there was something missing from it, and I think that is what was missing, was the Tim Burton like visuals. So I think had this book had illustrations, it would have added to it so much. But like I said, I think if this was ever actually adapted by Tim Burton or Disney with the Tim Burton artwork, it would work really well. One thing that I did really love about this story is that we got to explore so much more of this world in this book. Sally pretty much visits almost all of the magical doorways, and some of them she visits longer than others, so you don't get a full feel of them, but it was really interesting seeing her go into these other worlds. Like I said at the beginning, Jack and Sally honeymoon in Valentine's Day Town, and even though something like that isn't really my aesthetic, I can totally see like a Tim Burton version of that and just picturing it being like such a beautiful place. So again, I'm gonna say it again, if Disney ever decides to adapt this, I think it would be so cool to see these other holiday towns and how they would look with that whole Tim Burton visual to them. So I love the fact that we got to explore these other places in this story. One thing about the story though that I felt could have been a little bit different is I kind of wish that this had been told in the third person rather than first person from Sally's perspective. And my reasoning for that is because I feel like Sally has always been kind of a character of few words. Like, she speaks when it's important, when she really has something to say, and even like in the movie I feel like she doesn't have a ton of dialogue, and even in this book as the main character she doesn't have a ton of dialogue. However, because it's narrated by her, hearing her talk that much and like trying to picture her voice in my head the entire time that I was reading this book, it just didn't feel natural, because that's just not the kind of character that Sally strikes me as somebody that talks a lot. So I kind of wish that this would have been told in the third person with, you know, Sally's kind of minimal talking and just like saying the things that she feels are important, because that's just how I've always kind of pictured her character, and instead imagining the narrator in my head as being the narrator at the beginning of the movie that says, "'Twas a long time ago, longer now than it seems." Like, I think that would have just worked out better if it was told in the third person, but again, that's just my own personal preference and my own kind of take on Sally as a character. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this story was getting to see more of the legendary figures. So I don't know why, but I've always been obsessed with the legendary figures. Like, Rise of the Guardians is one of my favorite films to watch during the holidays, and I love like the Santa Claus movies when they have all the legendary figures there. So for some reason I've always just loved them. And so obviously in The Nightmare Before Christmas we see, you know, Jack as his own kind of figure. We see Santa Claus, we briefly see the Easter Bunny, but that's pretty much it. And in this book, obviously exploring some of the other towns, we get to see some of the other figures that you might not be too familiar with, but the actual antagonist of this book is a very well-known legendary figure. I won't give away who it is, but I really liked seeing their part in this story and this kind of adaptation of that character, because he was quite different from some of the other adaptations of this legendary figure. Again, I'm not going to give it away, but I really liked seeing that character and how they work in this book. My final kind of personal preference with this book that I felt could have been a little bit different was that there is an element of this story that deals with Sally's backstory and pretty much completely changes the dynamic between Sally and another character from when you're watching like The Nightmare Before Christmas. Like, the dynamic is completely changed, and I just didn't know how I felt about it. Like, there was just something about it that just didn't sit right with me when it came to this element of the story. Like I said, this is spoiler free, so I'm not going to talk about it specifically, but something about it just didn't work for me. I wasn't overly happy with it. So that is my final little issue that I had with this book, but other than that, I really enjoyed it. And my final thing about this book that I really enjoyed was that I believe this book was released before the Queen passed away, but I read it after she had passed, and the Queen actually makes a little appearance in this book, and I don't know why, but I just thought that that was the coolest thing. I guess because I had read it like not long after she had passed, and I'm pretty sure this book came out before, so I just thought that that was really interesting timing that she made like this little appearance in this book, and it was just really interesting to see that and see Sally seeing her, because one of the running themes throughout this book is Sally kind of being uncomfortable with the title of the Pumpkin Queen, and then, like I said, I don't want to give it away, but at one point she does see the Queen, and she, you know, kind of has this realization within herself. So I thought that that was really interesting and was probably one of my favorite scenes in this whole book. So that is my review of Long Live the Pumpkin Queen by Shea Ernshaw. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've read this book and what you thought of it. I'd love to discuss it with you in the comments, or let me know if it's a book that you're interested in reading, especially after watching my video. I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I did if you do decide to pick it up. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!